In this week's lectures, I'm going to continue our discussions on power to cover how economic systems and workplaces and the people that we encounter there hold power and influence our lived experiences around gender and sexuality. Now, much like a lot of other things that we've discussed in this class, the economic systems in which we live are social systems and are socially constructed. When we talk about economic social systems, we're talking about the ways that goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed by people, and how those processes both affect and are in turn affected by the social structures, the norms, the rules, the expectations of that society, particularly gendered and sexual expectations. Before we move on, I do want to mention one really important social construct, one really important and powerful social construct that we haven't really discussed in this class. We've discussed social constructs of identity, like gender, sexuality, and race, but there are more concrete social constructs that are also very powerful and influential in our lives, and perhaps the most influential one of all is the social construct of money. Money is incredibly powerful and influential, and I wouldn't argue otherwise, but money is a social construct. We all agree to abide by the same norms and expectations around money. I can go into to any store, give them what is essentially a piece of paper that we all agree is an important and powerful piece of paper, or I can give them this little piece of plastic, and they will let me walk out of the store with stuff. I do the same thing to pay rent on my apartment. Or for a service like a haircut. We all agree that money has a set amount of value and that we can exchange it for a certain number of things depending on how much money we have. That is not something that exists naturally in nature. That is a social construct that our society has actually quite recently, in the scope of human history, agreed is going to be powerful and influential in all of our lives. And we all abide by, or some people resist, the social construct of monetary power. Let's think for a minute about a non-monetary society or a subsistence or barter-based economy. How does this type of economic relationship, where one person might spend the majority of their time engaged in work to grow wheat, and while another person may raise cattle, the person who grows wheat may take some of that processed or unprocessed wheat to the person who grows cattle, they may exchange it, so they each benefit from the work of the other one, but without a monetary exchange. They're exchanging the direct products of their labor, the thing that they spend time doing, the thing they spend energy and work doing, they're exchanging for someone else's the product of someone else's work. No money involved in that type of exchange. How does this type of economic system affect social relationships? How might it affect gender roles, lived experiences, and how do those relationships and experiences affect the economic system? It's a two-way street and cause and effect there. Importantly, in this system, as I said, people receive a direct benefit from the product of their labor in this non-monetary subsistence or barter-based economy. You work really hard and you grow wheat, and that is the benefit of you have bread to eat or pasta to eat, and you can exchange that wheat for other things like milk, dairy products, or beef. In this type of system, but you're directly benefiting from the product of your labor. And that's very different from the economic system in which we lived, which is more of a capitalist global economy, where there are much more multi-directional arrows and different types of exchange going on. I can't take this lecture, this product of my labor, to Trader Joe's and buy tortilla chips with it. That's not how our economic system works. I have to exchange my labor for money, and then I take that money to Trader Joe's where I purchase tortilla chips. I don't know why I chose tortilla chips. Maybe I'm hungry. So how, again, does this type of economic system that's much more complicated and intricate affect our social relationships, our gender roles, our lived experiences, and then in turn, how do those relationships and experiences affect the economic system? In our economic system, people don't generally benefit directly from the products of their labor. We also currently live in what we're going to call a neoliberal economic system, and this may or may not be a term that you're familiar with. It extends to all areas. It's an economic system, but because of the interconnectedness that we've been talking about, it also affects our cultural and social lives. And until very, very recently, this was actually promoted very prominently by political parties on both the right and the left of political spectra in lots of different countries, not just the U.S. So here we have Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, both very prominent proponents of neoliberal economics in the neoliberal economic system in the 1980s, and then Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, who were on the other side of the political aisle in their respective countries, also big proponents of the neoliberal economic system in the next decade, in the 1990s. And this would also include people like George W. Bush and Barack Obama. These are all people who, in their political leadership, in the powerful roles that they held, promoted the neoliberal economic system. So I'm going to break down a little bit more of what that means in just a minute. In essence, it's a faith in free market capitalism, which may be a term you're more familiar with. So let's talk about some features of neoliberalism. It often involves cutting regulation, reducing or eliminating environmental and pollution controls, particularly those that were instituted in the 1960s and 70s, cuts to social safety net programs and social welfare programs, tax incentives to businesses and corporations instead of social welfare programs for individuals experiencing poverty, and privatizing publicly funded services like schools, libraries, road construction, even the military, in a way things that the government spends money on. Instead of the government doing them directly, the government would pay private companies to do them. That's sort of privatizing publicly funded services. Eliminating unions and the ability of workers to advocate collectively, and this idea of trickle-down prosperity. So this assumption that concentration of wealth, even in the hands of just a few people, literally just a few people, is not necessarily bad, but instead that wealth will eventually trickle down to the benefit of all. Trickle-down economics might also be a term that you're familiar with from different types of media. This neoliberal economic system and all of the features I've just described have become so normalized and so natural in our society that a lot of people don't even realize how unequal it's made our economic system. It's become such particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, it was so widely accepted as not just the best way to run an economic in a social system, but the only way to run an economic in a social system. And this led to really critical underestimations of how much wealth inequality has changed. And this is just an illustration of how an economic system can hold power and how we think about wealth. Because we thought that this way of distributing wealth was normal and natural and best for everyone, we assume that it isn't quite as unequal as it actually is. That's an incredibly powerful norm that this economic system that we all live in, this neoliberal economic system, helped to perpetuate. There's also a social side to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism promotes a highly individualistic sense of society and one's place in society. Therefore, financial struggles or successes are really due to individual failings or successes under this neoliberal economic system. There's very little regard for structural barriers or structural inequalities like racism, sexism, and classism, or the historical legacies of inequality and inequity and injustice. You may have heard this phrase, particularly about sort of American neoliberalism, this idea that this individual responsibility to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you shouldn't rely on others to help you, but should instead take individual personal action to achieve success. Both the economic and social effects of neoliberalism that I've talked about here compound the challenges for those who are already marginalized because of their gender or sexual identity or beyond. They amplify, they make those challenges harder to overcome. And that makes sense because, as this slide demonstrates, the approach to personal success in a neoliberal social system and economic system is individual. So the challenges that a group of people may face because of one or more aspects of their identity aren't taken into consideration by the people who hold power. And I thought this quote by Alicia Garza who is a leader in both the Black Lives Matter movement and the Women's March movement, really captures some of the challenges that some of the intersectional challenges that that this economic system poses, particularly for Black women in the U.S. I'm going to talk more about work in the next video, and we'll continue to take an intersectional approach in that lecture as well.